Though soft plastic baits have been around for over a quarter of a century now, the variety and complexity of profiles and presentations can make the subject seem mysterious and almost alien. This video will help clear the air surrounding these intriguing creatures.
Hi everybody. Welcome to the second in a series of programs on a proper use of soft plastic baits for bass. In the first segment we covered the basic families of baits and presentations. Now we're going to get a little deeper into when and where to put each into use. Also we'll take a look at some fine-tuned presentation techniques. Hey, by the end of this video, assuming you get out on the water and experiment yourself, you'll have a well-rounded understanding of what plastic bait to choose and how to fish it. First, let's take a look at when to use a jig worm as opposed to a Texas rig system. Dan Sura and Bob Ripley shed some practical light on this subject.
Grab a couple of these things are. Get rigged, they're waiting down there, Bubba. Bob, I'm going to use a standard Texas rig worm, and I'm using a 6-inch worm, which seems to be the real hot ticket right now. I'm going to simply Texas rig this puppy. And then something just a little bit different. Instead of a standard bullet weight, I'm going to use something called the Worm Dancer, which is a bullet sinker and a little bit of a rubber skirt to give me a little bulk, and it's going to help slow that worm down on the sink. And I'll tell you what, that's going to get me a lot of bass. What are you going to use, R?
A little lead head jig head with a hook on it that's exposed. It's a small hook, thin wire that can be tore through the weeds. This will take fish on the outside of the weed line, and you'll get them on the inside.
Bob, this weed line moves out and takes a slight bend to the right up here, and that inside turn's got some bigger fish.
Okay, if that runs along here and it comes out on a point, Dan, I'm going to sort of parallel cast it here and let you cast up into the weeds. Little mushroom jig heads really work good on the outside edge of those weed lines. Yeah, you see those bait fish in there, Dan, right now. That's what I'm looking for along the edge of the weed line. Lots of times the sunfish will be up high and your bass will be underneath it.
There you go. I told you, Bob, those fish are right here. Woo! Hot fish. The fish was right on the point. Not bad. You see it, Bob? Oh, yeah.
Not bad at all. First fish off the deep weed line. Got him stuck good. Okay, fat fish came off that weed line, Dan. Boy, they're in there.
You know, Bob, you're going to pick off those more active fish before I get to them with this plastic worm. But I tell you something, Bubba, before the day's done, I'm going to get a bigger fish than you because I know those big guys are tucked up inside a little bit.
There we go, Dan. We got another one.
Whoa!
Right on that edge.
Yeah! Get a lip on him, R.
All right, Dan. Another one off that small jig head. Boy, that small hook gets him right on the edge of that weed line. That's fun. Nice, healthy fish. Like that. The beautiful part about this, Dan, is you can use a good graphite rod. It's got a little bit of backbone to it, open face spinning reel, 8 to 10 pound test line, and you're set with this little jig. All you gotta do is pop it when you set the hook, and remember to play the fish. You can't horse them out of here because you're using a little lighter line.
Come on, come on. Dropped it. Jiggle. Come on. Ah, yeah. Oh, yeah. This is weight here, bub. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah. Whoa, whoa. Look at that, Bob. Look at that. Did you see that? Look at the size of this one. I wonder why I fish a wow. Look at that rod bend. Come to Papa. Oh, there you go, Bob. How's that? Summertime weed line bass. It don't get no better than that. Woo. There you go, girl. He ate my worm. I got to get another worm. I want another cast in there, Bob. Don't move this boat. Wait, I'm actually shaking. I know there's more of them out there, Bob. Right there. Come on. That worm was sitting on the bottom. I felt the fish pick the worm up and then spit it, and I just jiggled the worm in place. Just jiggle the rod, let it sit there, jiggle the rod, let it sit there, and that fish swam up and boom, inhaled it. I'm sure if I'd have continued fishing through that fish the way I was, move it and pause, fish wouldn't have bit. Sometimes those bigger fish really like that ultra slow presentation.
And we're slid off it just a little bit now, Dan.
Work back in that inside corner too. The more active fish will be on the point, but sometimes those bigger fish will hold back in that pocket with a little bit thicker weed cover in there. A little bit better break down there too. Ah, yeah! Oh, yes! Oh! Oh, I don't know. Oh, oh, good fish. Oh, oh, strong. Yeah, Bob. Gonna jump. Yeah, wow, you see that fish? You see the size of that, Bob? Holy moly. Oh, oh, there's some horse. Oh, gee whiz. Come on. Wow.
Bring him in.
I gotta show this fish to you, Bob. I want you to take a good look at what a largemouth bass looks like. I'll tell you what, folks. We've been having a gas out here this afternoon. Summertime means deep weed line bass. And Bob, what are you using again?
Simple little jig head, exposed hook, and a 4-inch worm.
Boy, that's deadly. And I'll tell you what I was doing. I was pitching with a plastic worm up just a little bit inside and fishing the heavier weeds. And today, well, the bigger fish were inside. I'll tell you what, Bob, let's switch and maybe you can get a few of these big boys.
It's a 1-2 punch that's hard to beat.
Hey, weed line bass,
All right.
summertime bass, it don't get no better than this. Woo!
Well, folks, I hope that helps some. Now let's take a look at a fine-tuned method for presenting exposed hook jig worms. Hey, it's a method that takes a little bit of practice, but as you'll see, it's loads of fun and effective too.
What's shaking? Well, there's a whole lot of shaking going on. Shaking and doodling, that is. This light line worming technique has become extremely popular in clear water situations, such as the one In-Fisherman Dan Sura and Bass Pro Rich Tauber are faced with. Now let's join them as they explore this fun method for taking bass from clear water anywhere.
Keep that sucker right down there on the bottom. Just keep shaking it, Dan.
You know, I've been watching you, Rich, and I think I'm finally getting the action here. It's just a little bit of a wrist action.
Yeah, keep that rhythm going. Keep shaking it.
There he is.
Nice smallmouth. Look at that.
Wild fish. Boy, those critters are tough, aren't they?
Open your mouth there. There he is. What a beautiful fish that is, huh? They're sure pretty.
We know this technique of yours works. Why don't you share with the folks a little bit on how the rigging goes about for catching these deep water fish?
What you have is a jig head, an exposed hook. You've got the worm out there 15, 20, 30, 40 feet of water, shaking it. When the fish takes the worm into his mouth, that hook is exposed. So even if he just takes it in a little bit, when you're jiggling that rod, those are all little miniature little hook sets, basically. You know, you're tightening your line. And if he takes it in, that hook will catch in some part of his mouth, some part of the skin, and the fish almost sets himself. I mean, you know he's there, then you can unload and set the hook.
Oh, yeah! Woo-hoo!
I had him in a tree down there. Oh, easy now, easy.
Gonna jump one more time.
Oh, he's got it. There he is.
Hey dude, that's not bad for a semi-professional surfer and a professional tournament fisherman, but I'm after smallmouth.
Now what you're doing is you throw out, and the minute that that worm hits the water, here, let me throw out and I'll show you right here from the start. You reel your worm in, pick it up, throw it out there about 30 or 40 feet. Hits the water, lift your rod up, click the reel into gear, and the minute it hits the water, I'm right now shaking it. So what that worm is doing is swimming and shaking its way down. You don't want to let it go all the way to the bottom before you start to move and jiggle that rod tip. Now, if you look at the rod tip, the tip constantly moves about 6 to 8 inches, and it never stops the whole time. You're throwing that little jiggling, little hula dance action into your worm the whole time. Now, as long as your line is tight, your worm's sinking. You know that. So you never reel while your line is tight. Jiggle, 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 pop, 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 pop. Now my line just went slack. That tells me I'm on the bottom. I reel a couple times, keep jiggling that rod tip. Now this is the key. You're jiggling it. Very rarely, maybe 5% of the total strikes you get, you'll actually feel. Have you noticed today how you jiggle and it feels like a little 1/8 ounce weight? That little dart head, that little weight we showed you earlier is jiggling down there. When it feels like 1/4 of an ounce, you got one.
Oh, yeah. You see that? You see that? Oh, yes. Boy, these critters are feisty. Wow. Got a good kick there. There you go. There you go. Oh, beautiful. How's that, Rich? Wow, what a technique. Red hot.
You know, that shaking and doodling technique tends to work particularly well in clear water situations. Another subtle presentation that works well in clear water is the use of small, stubby plastic baits we refer to as grubs. Depending on how these are fished, they can mimic forage ranging from shad to crawfish. Take a look at this.
Oh, nice bass. Just twitching that thing. Ooh, nice smallmouth. How's that for a smallmouth? You know, these fish love jigs any time of the year. And I think that smallmouth think that a jig is actually a crayfish. Of all the jigs that you can fish for smallmouth bass or any other fish to imitate a crayfish, there is none better than this little thing that I'm using right now. Let me show you how to rig it. The first half of the combo that we're using is a little split-tail grub. See what it looks like? It's kind of orange on the bottom and kind of brownish on top, color just like a crayfish. What I'm going to do is just bite off the first 1/4 of an inch or so, make it flat, then I'm going to rig it on this special jig head that has a little flat back and 2 little barbs on it to hold the grub in place. Just stick her right in the middle, then thread it on down, and make sure that the hook comes right out in the center of the grub. Yeah, like that. What's unique about this little split tail is the way that it works in the water. When you jig a regular jig up and down, the jig jigs up and down. These little split tails, because of the way that the water pressure acts on the surface of the jig, which is semi-rigid, as you twitch it, the thing kind of zings back and forth, and it acts just like a real crayfish in the water. Let me show you how it works. Now you work this a little differently than you'd work a regular jig. You want to throw it out and let it settle. After it's on the bottom, you just kind of go pop, 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 pop. And that causes it to kind of zigzag back and forth. And let it back down again. Pop it.
tight line it down. A lot of times I'll hit it on the drop, but a lot of times I'll hit it just as you begin to accelerate it. They kind of start to chase it, and then as it drops, I come up and smack it. There's nothing that fights like a smallmouth pound for pound. Come on back. He really hammered that little grub. Come on. What a pretty little fish. Oh. Well, it looks like he got my grub. So I'm going to have to put on another one. And I'd suggest that the next time you're on your favorite smallmouth bass water, you do the same. Take a little split-tail grub, bite the head off, stick it on your jig, and you got yourself an instant crayfish.
The concept of dead sticking, leaving the bait motionless or just moving it ever so slowly, can seem foreign when referring to an artificial bait, but don't kid yourself. With methods like a wacky worm, a jig and pig, dead sticking can be deadly. Now then, throughout the course of a year, various baits and presentation methods come into play. As the In-Fisherman calendar indicates, fish behave differently at different times of the year, and their location will vary as well. Spring is a unique season as bass move into, utilize, and then move away from their spawning areas. Let me show you what some of the best baits are for cashing in on the wealth of opportunities found in early season bass fishing.
It's springtime, finally. The water in the mud-bottom bays is warming fast from the heat of the sun. The warmth brings to life many a critter from their long winter sleep. The warmth draws invaders to these back bays, which can be more than 10 degrees warmer than the main lake. One of the first intruders in many lakes to enter the bay will be northern pike, soon followed by sunfish, crappies, and largemouth bass. The bay is alive with activity, filled with everything from tiny minnows to monster pike. All this activity draws two more invaders to the bay. Al Lindner and In-Fisherman editor Steve Quinn, knowing the attraction to bass of protection and the abundance of food in backwater bays, have come to check such a spot for their favorite quarry.
Get a good one, Steve. Way up inside that wood there. A little bit better. Tell you what, early season bass fishing, I love it. I love it. And by early season, we're talking pre-spawn fish, where you catch lots and lots of bass like this, and some big fish to boot. You know, there's 5 soft plastic concoctions that really work well this time of the year. One of them is a jig with a crawfish-looking worm on the back of it, or a jig and eel. Both of them tend to produce really big fish. Another bait that I like to use a lot of is the tube, referred to as the Gets It. This one is rigged weedless here because I'm fishing in brush with a slip sinker like this, or if you're in areas that don't have a lot of cover, you're fishing on a jig head like this. Steve's got another one. Ooh, nice fish, nice fish.
Now look here, this fish just ate that whole plastic bait up. Yeah, he just did swallow that whole thing. He took that plastic soft stick bait and just sucked her in. A pretty fish, yeah. See the pre-spawn, she's just starting to swell up a little bit.
With water temperature still in the upper 40s and low 50s, the bass's activity level is fairly lethargic. Baits like spinnerbaits and buzzbaits, which work very effective in warm water, move too quickly for slow-moving largemouths. Subtle lures that can be presented slowly and stay in a bass's small strike zone for a long time work the best. Some of the best lures for early season bass are plastics like a jig and craw, tube lures, plastic stick baits, and small 4 and 5 inch worms rigged in 2 different methods. A split shot in Texas rig and a rig called a wacky worm. Each we'll cover in detail. The jig and craw is a bulky lure. It has a large profile and falls slowly to give cold water bass a prolonged look at a bait. A light weedless jig head allows the lure to sink slowly and pass through cover easy.
Look at spring jump. Alright. Now there's another soft plastic option, a soft plastic stick bait. That's a real good spring choice. Oftentimes when the water warms up into that upper 50 to 60 degree range, your soft stick baits really come into their own. They're good shallow working plastic and the fish will grab it and really hang on to them. It imitates a little bait fish or a shad.
Oh yeah, you've been there good. You know, this time of the year, if I got to count on something to put a fish in a boat, count on it. I gotta go with that Gets It, that tube bait. Gets It is the wrong name for tube bait that so many manufacturers make. I mean, them tubes, yeah, those tubes early in the season, boy, it's hooked are so solid, Steve. Those tubes, like this power tube, are deadly in this early cold water period. Absolutely deadly. Look at how fat she is.
Like that.
Yeah.
There we go. Now that one hit the old split shot worm. Another great soft plastic rigging for early spring fishing. It's a real subtle bait. You just are using a 4 or 5 inch very thin worm and a single split shot. Set up the line 12 to 18 inches. The shot causes the worm to kind of drift down in the water very slowly, and you just very easily move it through your cover, and just all of a sudden the bass will suck it in and you'll just feel a little weight. And then you set the hook. It's a real good bait early in the season or whenever fish are really off. It can get you some extra bites.
Let me show you a little concoction that's really worked well for us over the years, and very few people know about it. Now down south they refer to it in Texas as a wacky worm, but that ain't the name of a worm. It's how you rig it. You got a standard 2/0 worm hook. You take plain old straight tail worm like this. Now it's important when you rig this worm that you take the hook and put it into the band on a worm, put it through it just like this, and that's all you want it to do is stay straight like that. Looks weird, doesn't it? Well, that isn't the whole key. Then you take a piece of a nail like that and you stick the nail in the nose of the worm. You push it all the way in so it's straight, and the nail now becomes your slip sinker or your jig head. This thing is deadly in shallow water or spook water. Incredibly deadly and not used by a lot of anglers. Actually what it does, it sinks down to the bottom like this, weight-wise, and it just kind of sits up like that. Let me show you how you fish this thing. You leave it sink to the bottom and you just kind of shake the worm, just like this. You shake it and leave it sit on the bottom, just shake it, pump it back, oh, maybe 3-4 feet, it folds over like a U, you leave it sink back to the bottom, and you just sit there and shake that thing. And all of a sudden they'll come, thunk, and move right away with it. Yeah, on that wacky worm. Ooh, yeah, we're in a better one. Come on. Oh, look at that beauty. Oh. Ate my little brown wacky worm up. Kind of in a good position where he's supposed to be. I'll tell you what, folks. You do a lot of early season bass fishing, live in some of these states that don't have seasons, where you can get in on that pre-spawn bite. Take these 5 pointers that we gave you with soft plastics, put them to use, and you're going to catch lots of bass like this. And remember, put them back. As summer establishes itself, fish move away from their spawning areas into summer feeding positions. Often this will be deep along weed edges, on submerged humps, or wherever forage is located. These fish are feeding and growing. During summer and fall, big baits can mean big fish. There's a time and a place for using these hog baits. Let me show you what I mean. Good start, man. Nice bass, Troy. Oh, look at that. Look at that one, huh? Woo! Oh, she's a good one, Troy. Oh, man. Come here, baby. That's the way to start the day off, folks, with your third cast. Get you in the right frame of mind. Hey, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis in the last 5 years on finesse fishing for bass, light lining, split shotting, 4-inch worms, gitsits. And there's no question that in the right place at the right time, finesse fishing is critical. But just on the other side of that coin, there's a place for big, bulky, and heavy, like we're using here. 3/4 and 1 ounce jigs, big giant plastic worms, huge 1 ounce spinner baits, big minnow baits, big crankbaits. That's what we're talking about today. Big, bulky, and heavy for big fish.
Bunch of wheat. That's what they're living in.
When you're fishing big, heavy baits like this 3/4 or 1 ounce jig and big giant slip sinkers and that, you don't go with real long casts. We're fishing heavy coontail here in some broadleaf cabbage. A long cast lays that line over that jig. I mean, a jig over the weeds, and it's hard to penetrate down. And that's one of the places that it's so important for a big heavyweight, as an example. In this case, a slip rig worm or a jig head. When you want to penetrate deep weeds, slide through the weeds and get to the bottom. So you want to stay kind of vertical, not long casts. I'm actually fishing the outside edges first. Fishing the outside rim first, then I'll come back in a little bit shallower. And the shallower I get, the denser the cover, the more vertical I go. You get that big juicy craw on there, they eat that thing, they're gonna murder it. Oh, another good, ooh, Troy! Oh, come on up here. I'll tell you what, that's one of the advantages of fishing with big, heavy equipment with these big baits, and it's a necessity. You see the way I just flipped that dude in? I'm using 20-pound test line, 6.5 foot heavy action rod. You use from 6.5 to 7.5 foot, 17, 20, 25-pound test, bait casting. This is no place for the ultralight enthusiast. You can't fish these big baits with light line and light equipment. That's what a lot of people try, and they make a big mistake. Hey, let me show you some of our favorite big bass concoctions. Big and bulky are the key words when picking your arsenal of soft plastic lures. Big 5/8 ounce to 1 ounce weedless jigs trailed with large crawfish imitations or jumbo pork frogs. Big and bulky Texas rigs in combination with large soft plastics like big crawfish or a big lizard with large paddle type tails. Any soft plastic that gives a large profile. 8, 9, and 10-inch worms rigged up on bullet sinkers that go at least a ½ ounce in weight. Yeah. Oh, man. I'll tell you one thing, folks. When them bass pound those big baits, they just annihilate them. It's not like a little finesse bait that when they pick it up, they just swim away with it. These big bass just pound that thing. Hey, kid, it's getting to be your turn. I'm gonna change up here real quick and go to a big, fat, juicy worm, Troy. Got a big, heavy, bulky slip sinker, 3/4 ounce. Big, heavy worm, big, fat paddle tail. Another time and a place to use bigger baits. Now remember, I'm not only talking jigs or plastic worms like we happen to be using here. I'm talking big spinner baits, big minnow baits, big crankbaits. Big in general is in dirty water lakes. Stained water or dirty water. Water that has, let's say, a maximum visibility of about 4 feet or less. That's a critical part of it. Dark to stained water, bigger baits, particularly real big baits like this, will always outfish little finesse baits. Same thing with night fishing.
This fish is big.
She's coming up, Look at her. Oh, man, Troy!
Oh,
Keep the rod up, man. Get her rid of that stuff. Oh, look, she's going way on the other side of the boat.
yeah. This is big.
Get a lip lock on her.
This is my biggest bass of the year for sure. Oh, this guy's big.
I got him. Troy, you're going to have to come up to the front here. I got another big one. Look at that. Look at that one, boy. You're going to have to get up. Get right in that spot, kiddo. Look at that one. Ooh, man. Hallelujah. You're talking about catching big bass. You in that spot, make sure you get it to the bottom, man. You talk about a school of fish. Folks, I'll tell you what, there is no question in my mind at all that big baits, heavy jigs, big worms, big spinner baits, catch bigger fish. Remember that old cliche, you want big fish, use big baits? I'll tell you what, it's true. Hey, along with calendar periods, there are other factors as well which will determine your choice of soft plastic baits. We're going to take a final overview of the subject and tie up some loose ends for you.
Probably the most asked, but most difficult to answer question about fishing is which lure do I use? And it's even more confusing with soft plastics because there's so many choices of sizes and color.
To help clarify the issue, we've put together this chart, which is a bit of an oversimplification because fish behave according to daily fluctuations as well as major seasonal changes, but the principles act as a guideline. In early spring, when the water is 45 degrees or colder, only the slowest dead-sticking techniques with subtle baits like tube jigs will do. You might even try live baits in these instances. But as water reaches the 50-degree range, bass begin their pre-spawn phase, working shallow flats. During this time, horizontal baits like the Slug-Go will produce as well as light tube baits. The wacky worm can be deadly too, and small lizards are known spring producers. As fish approach the spawn period 55-degree surface temperatures, they become more aggressive and territorial. Slightly larger, flashier baits come to bear, like a jig and craw. It's not a good idea to fish bass when they're on their spawning beds. But as post-spawn arrives with water temperatures in the 60s, bass will spread out over the flats to the first drop-offs or edges. Jig worms, Texas rigs, jig and craws, or horizontal baits over the tops of submergent weeds will all play their parts. Summer will move on, and groups of bass will set up in their mid-season haunts. Some will be deeper, often suspended near deep breaks close to bait fish. This is where Carolina rigs will come into their own, along with Texas rigs and jig worms. Don't forget to fish the shallow slop with weedless methods as well. When the water temperatures begin to cool and fall, it's a season for fishing big baits like the jig and craw, lizards, big Texas rigs, or odd-shaped baits. These all should be fished fairly slowly as bass metabolism winds down. At the end of the fall period, jigs tipped with live baits like minnows or water dogs are your best bet.
Oh, another real nice one. Not quite as big as the other one, but he's a nice one. A typical cool waterfall fish on a great big bait. Now you can see the temperature isn't an exact science, but it gives you some good guidelines. and it's largely metabolic. Water clarity is a little bit different. It's more physiological. Let me explain it.
Bass are highly sight-oriented when it comes to feeding. In clear water, they will often move long distances to strike a bait. However, in darker stained water, they won't move nearly as far and have the tendency to stay closer to cover. Because of this, subtly colored smaller baits with a slow fall are more effective in clear water situations. And on the other hand, when dealing with dark water, larger, heavier, more visible baits should be fished tighter to cover. Other things you might try in dark water are the use of rattling jig heads or worm rattle inserts. Texas rigs fished ahead of beads will produce a clacking sound also, and it won't hurt to use a scent concoction. Experiment with colors. Color often involves the local preference of the fish. In heavily fished waters, try using some profiles that the bass may not have seen before.
Good looking fish. And a good way to kind of cap things off. As you can see, you've got almost more choices than you know what to do with. But with a few simple guidelines, you can choose right most of the time.
Well, folks, there you have it. Everything you ever wanted to know about soft plastics, but were afraid to ask. Actually, there's still more on the subject. There's always going to be more. And hey, maybe we'll be back sometime with a third part in this series. But in the meantime, get out and experiment. Nothing beats time on the water. And if you apply some of the principles and techniques we just covered, it'll be time wisely spent. Maybe you'll be the next person to come up with a hot new technique. You never know. Till next time, we'll see you on the water.